Après votre introduction, ma tête est devenue très grande. Il y a une fois, quand je peux parler avec vous en français, mais il y a depuis 24 ans que j'ai étudié le français, j'ai oublié tout mon vocabulaire. Il faut que je parle en anglais, je suis désolé. I apologize for speaking in English, but I can do the questions and answers probably. You can speak to me in French and I can understand. I want to thank all the representatives of the school system and the canton and the university who are here tonight. I particularly want to commend the Minister of Education for his very strong statement that this is not just necessary, but it is a high priority for the district. I think that's incredibly important. Leadership from the very top is so very critical, so thank you for that. I want to particularly thank, though, Elizabeth Torango. Without your leadership, there would be no gathering like this tonight. So I would like you to join me in giving Madame Torango a round of applause. Now, I live in New York City, which is a part of the United States that is known for people speaking extremely fast. So I will, and I've been to 49 American states and 9 foreign countries to speak. I was in an American state called Texas, which has sent many terrible things to us. But in Texas once, a woman raised her hand during my presentation. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Son, you're talking faster than I can listen." So if at any point today, if you're following in English and I'm talking faster than you can listen, please stop me. I'm going to cover a lot of material today, and some of it, for those of you who are, I met some incredible activists last night in the Geneva LGBT community, will be very basic, and you'll say, "I know all this already." Some of it hopefully will be new. But I'd like to start by reviewing some basic concepts about sexuality. Like Gaul, sexuality is divided into 3 parts. Oh, come on, somebody took Latin. Somebody must get that joke. Everyone has everyone has slides, hopefully. Excellent. Everyone has a sexual orientation. Your sexual orientation spans a spectrum from heterosexual to bisexual to homosexual. And it falls along a spectrum by Dr. Kinsey from 0 to 6. 6 is exclusively homosexual, and to the delight of gay people, if you're exclusively heterosexual, you're a 0. So then there is your sexual behavior. This is what you do in bed. It is not your sexual orientation. It is the acts people engage in. And then there is your sexual identity. One of the things I've learned in my 36 hours in Geneva is how the Francophone press often uses the words homosexuelle to describe LGBT people. That is a mistake, because homosexual is an orientation or perhaps a behavior. It is not an identity. What an identity is a socially constructed concept of how you present yourself to the world. One can be gay, one can engage in homosexual acts, one can have a homosexual orientation. Does this make sense? And the critical thing to understand is, for young people's health, we want these 3 things to be in alignment. If you have a heterosexual sexual orientation, you're engaging in bisexual sexual acts, and you're telling everyone you're gay, you have a problem. So this is not the outcome we want. Well, unfortunately, the problem is, because there's so much homophobia in society, people who have homosexual orientation, homosexual behavior, often feel a need to hide their gay identity and not disclose that to people. And that is the source of the problem we're addressing today. Now, some of you may have pens or pencils or iPhones. I think everyone in Geneva has an iPhone, from what I can see. I'd like to do what we call in America a pop quiz. Think back for a moment. At what age were you when you first realized your sexual orientation? Don't shout out the answer. When you first realized you were attracted to boys, girls, or both if you're bisexual. Think about this for a second and write your answer down. 15 more seconds. It should be easy. It's not a difficult quiz. Okay, I need 5 brave volunteers who will tell me their answer. There is no right or wrong answer here. I just want to hear, I'm doing my own little scientific research here in Switzerland about the ages at which people recognize their sexual orientation in Switzerland. Any 5 people want to throw out an age? 18? 13? 16? 12? 17. So I got 12, 13, 16, 17, and 18. All right? Now, the median is therefore 16. Median, as you know, because you're all smart students at university, is not the average. It doesn't mean everybody realized it at 16. It means that half the people realized it by 16, half the people realized it after 16. All right? Apparently, you're a little slow in Switzerland. So, I'm sorry. I'm sure if we chose 5 different people, we've gotten 5 different answers. But studies of LGBT youth in the United States find that they recognize their sexual orientation at a median age somewhere between 8 and 11. Now, I doubt really that Swiss people are any different than American people, so I would imagine the same is true here. This is very important for the educators in the room, because that means that you need to look at your 2nd graders, your 3rd graders, your 4th graders, and your 5th graders, and realize they are realizing their sexual orientation. Now, if I was sadistic, I would ask you to tell me about your first sexual behavior. I won't. But we found in the United States that young LGBT people engage in their first sexual behavior sometime between 13 and 16. So this is very important to recognize, because when you are teaching and you're looking at 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, we need to realize that they're beginning to experience their sexuality. And the thing, none of that is really new. Those numbers have probably been the same since the Garden of Eden. But what is new, at least in America, is the next statistic. Young people are now coming out at a median age of between 15 and 17. In other words, somewhere between their 10th and 12th grades of high school. This is very different than when I was a child. I'm 48 years old. In my generation, you hid the fact that you were gay until you went off to university. As you probably know, most American students live at their university. Then you would come home on holiday, tell your parents, and that's how you did it. And you went back to university. But in America today, young people are beginning to come out at an age-appropriate stage, which is in high school. So this is becoming an issue that our generation really suffered in silence. This generation, thankfully, is not. Now, we did a poll of students in America, and one of the questions we asked was if they were gay. One of the questions you see here is that, in fact, their willingness to disclose that they are gay, lesbian, or bisexual increases as they get older. When they're in their early years of high school, about 4% will say they're LGBT. When they are in their junior and senior years of high school, it rises to about 6.5%. So let me put this in context here for you for a second. 6.5% means 1 out of every 16 students. What is the average class size in a Swiss high school? I don't know. 25? So that means it's pretty much statistically impossible that you have a high school classroom in Switzerland in which there's not at least 1 gay student. Now keep in mind also, these are young people who are willing to tell a pollster they do not know that they are gay. So this number is an underestimate. The actual number must be higher. So even if we take this very conservative estimate, though, we know that at least 1 in 16 students is gay, lesbian, or bisexual, which means every classroom in Switzerland has at least 1 gay student. Now let me define a couple of terms for you. Homophobia, which we've heard a great deal about today, is the conscious prejudice towards people based on their sexual orientation. I want to contrast that with the concept of heterosexism, which is an unconscious bias. Essentially, all people in society grow up expecting that everyone will be heterosexual. That's an expectation we learn at a very early age before we know this. And I want to make a point here. Everyone regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, has both homophobia and heterosexism. We're all raised in a society where we learn these concepts before we're old enough to know better, and we spend most of our lives trying to unlearn them. Now, what do I mean by heterosexism and the assumption that everyone is heterosexual? It's what we call in America part of the system of unearned privilege or invisible advantages. Unearned privileges are privileges that go to groups of society that they did nothing to work for, nothing to earn. They simply got them through an accident of birth. And they work in Swiss society as well. Like, for instance, I've been in Geneva for 2 days. I've been able to walk around, go into restaurants, go into shops. I've never once had to worry, is someone going to treat me differently because of the color of my skin? Because I'm white. That's an unearned privilege I get. And it's an invisible advantage usually to the people who have them. So unearned privileges work in many ways. For instance, how many of you are left-handed? Okay. Do not answer this question. What are invisible advantages that right-handed people get in society? Can you think of some? Scissors. What else? The mouse on the computer. Exactly. My mouse is over here. What else? Notebooks open a certain way. These are all examples of unearned privileges that right-handed people like me get that just make our lives a little bit easier. Now, those are kind of fun examples. I guess unless you're left-handed, they're probably not that fun. But we get to issues like race, like religion, like gender, like sexual orientation. It's not funny anymore because it has real impacts on people's lives. And I would argue that this is more difficult to unlearn than homophobia because it is unconscious. And I do a little exercise to demonstrate this, if you will amuse me. Please fold your arms. Now fold your arms the other way. You notice how uncomfortable it is? We have a way that we're used to folding our arms, and when we change it, we're uncomfortable. We have a way we're used to viewing people, and that is as heterosexual. And when we have to change, it is uncomfortable. Now, I'll tell you a funny story, just because I want to make it clear tonight that I'm not blaming any group in society for this issue, that all of us struggle with this. I was once in Chicago, actually when I was working with Stefan, I think. And I was late for a speech, and it was snowing, and I was at the airport, and I went to get my rental car. So I approached the rental car desk, and there's a very long line. And I finally get to the front, and the gentleman asked me, "Where do you work?" Now, when you work for the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, every day is a choice about whether or not you want to discuss your sexual orientation with someone else. Because if you say what you do, it's going to come up. This day, I just want my car. I want out of the Chicago airport. So I say, "I work for GLSEN." And he says, "What does that stand for?" I said, "Well, it's G as in Georgia, L as in Louisiana, S as in Susan." He says, "No, what do the letters stand for?" And I'm like, "There's a huge line. It's in the Chicago airport. Everyone's listening." I'm like, "Fine. It's gay, lesbian." And I spell it out for him. And he says, "Thank you," and he gives me the keys. I walk away from the counter. I get to about here, and I look at my keys, and I have the keys for a luxury car. Now, we're a small, poor nonprofit. We only get not little tiny cars, you know. We don't get the big luxury cars. So I'm very annoyed with this gentleman now. So I come back to the counter, and I say, "Sir, you have given me the wrong car." And he said, "Honey, you just got a free upgrade." That is heterosexism at work. It is me assuming automatically that the man at the counter must be heterosexual. Now, if I do it, you do it. We all do it, okay? Now, let's talk about gender issues as well. I think the word transgender may be less familiar for people than gay or lesbian is. And gender is also constructed in 3 parts. First of all, there is your sex. Your sex is a biological fact. You're born with certain anatomy, and we label some people male, some people female, or in some cases where people are born with both types of genitalia, we call them intersexed. Gender expression is different than your sex. Your sex is a biological fact. Gender expression is a social construct. We have beliefs that certain behaviors are masculine, certain types of dress are masculine, certain types of dress are feminine, certain actions are feminine. There's nothing biological about that. We believe that. And then gender identity is whether or not your gender identity, and what we are struggling with here is to make sure that young people who are transgender, and what that term means is people who go outside of the identity or expression that people expect them to have because of their biological sex. Does that make sense? That's why we call it transgender. Ideally, just like we want people's orientation, behavior, and identity to line up, we want people's sex, gender expression, and gender identity to line up. That's the healthy outcome for transgender people. So, those are our basic concepts. And as I mentioned, if you're not familiar with a transgender, it's an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity or gender expression does not conform to what is socially expected based on their biological sex. Some people, there's a spectrum here, just like there is with sexual orientation. Some people choose to have gender reassignment surgery. Some people do not. But the goal is to allow people to live in a way in according with the truth that they feel, not what society feels. Now let's talk about young people's experiences in school. And one thing that we know from studies in America is that in our country, bullying of LGBT students is among the most common problem that we have in terms of bullying. We asked high school students what are the most common reasons that bullying occurs. The number 1 reason they came up with was physical appearance or body size. People are too tall, too fat, too thin, too short, too whatever. The second reason was real or perceived sexual orientation, because sometimes young people perceive someone to be gay who may not actually be gay. The number 3rd reason was their gender expression, how masculine or feminine they were. Boys that were too feminine were relentlessly harassed. Girls that were too masculine were also relentlessly harassed. Then the following issues came in order: ability at school, race, ethnicity, class, and religion. So when you consider that sexual orientation and gender expression are 2 of the top 3 causes of bullying in the States, you can see that we have a massive problem. When you ask young LGBT people themselves how often they hear anti-gay language, the responses are overwhelming. In the United States, the expression "that's so gay" has become synonymous with "that is bad, that is stupid, that is unacceptable." We ask students how often they hear that used in a pejorative or negative manner. 89% said they hear it frequently or often. Only 2% said they hear it rarely. And my understanding is that the expression "pede" has become much the same here in Switzerland. It's used generically, not just to refer to gay people. I bet if you were to do a similar survey in Switzerland, you would find similar results. Now, some people say, well, that's just language, not such a big problem. When you tolerate hateful language, you will get hateful behavior. We then ask students, how often are you verbally harassed? That is when you are singled out and harassed verbally, not just you're walking down the hall and you hear someone say "that's so gay." And the results were shocking. 40% of students said that happened to them frequently or often, 25% sometimes, only 20% said it happened to them rarely. So for most LGBT students in America, verbal harassment occurs sometimes, frequently, or often. And that harassment tends to escalate in a dangerous way. When we ask students how often that harassment becomes physical, 47% told us that they experience physical harassment. 21% experience actual physical assault, and that means being assaulted with a weapon or in some other very dangerous way. The American government last year released its first report on LGBT youth out of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And this is from a massive national survey of youth in which they asked for the first time how the questions around sexual orientation. I want to stop for a second here. If there is one thing I hope you will do in Switzerland as a result of my visit, it is to add this question to your national surveys of youth. It is absolutely critical that you get data about what is actually happening in schools. And I will bet that your data will come back and be just as disturbing to you in Switzerland as it is to us in the United States. LGBT students were 40% more likely to get into a physical fight. It gets worse. The fights they get into are worse than the fights heterosexual kids get into, so that they are 5 times more likely to actually be physically injured in a fight. Usually these fights are in self-defense. They are 3 times more likely to be threatened or injured with a weapon while at school. Consequently, they are 5 times more likely not to go to school because they felt unsafe at school or on their way to or from school. 5 times more likely. 1 in 5 American LGBT students is missing school regularly because they're too afraid to go, as opposed to 1 in 20 heterosexual students. Now, that's a very grim picture, and the results of it, the impact of it on young people is equally grim. Now, I want to make a point of this slide, because what it looks at is the effects of victimization on student grade point averages. We have, I don't know the grading scale in Switzerland, but a 4 is an A, a 3 is a B in America. All right, what we find is that when students are routinely harassed, their grade points drop significantly by a half a point, from a B minus to a C. One of the things I want to note about this slide is, and let me be very, very clear, there is nothing wrong with LGBT youth. That's what this slide shows us. Because when they are not harassed, they perform very well in school. There's something wrong with the environment. And when they are harassed, as would be expected, their performance declines. Neuroscientists have done brain imaging. And one of the things they've discovered is that when someone is afraid, the parts of their brain that learn literally stop functioning. It is impossible for people who are afraid to learn physically. That explains why some LGBT youth do worse in school, because they're in an environment that's so negative that their brains cannot function properly. They also turn to some negative coping mechanisms to deal with the hostility that they face. They're about 1/3 more likely to drink alcohol. And when you get to more dangerous drugs in America, the differential escalates rapidly. They're about 6 times more likely to use cocaine, about 8 times more likely to use heroin. Now, I don't want to leave you here with some image that all LGBT youth are big drug abusers. That's not my point. My point is that when you put people in a hostile environment, some people will seek to escape. And the use of alcohol or other drugs is simply a means to try and escape from a hostile environment that you face every day. LGBT youth are not to blame for these statistics, we are. And of course, as has gotten a great deal of media attention, at least in the United States, LGBT students are profoundly more at risk for suicide. They're 3 times more likely to consider attempting suicide. Notice the difference in the next slide. They're 4 times more likely to actually attempt suicide. They are 6 times more likely to have been so injured in their suicide attempt that they had to be taken to a hospital. So the more dangerous the behavior, the greater the differential. When gay students try to kill themselves, they mean it. There's some people who like to write off adolescent suicide attempts as an effort to get attention or something like that. This is not an effort to get attention. This is an effort to die. So, this has been cheerful, I'm sure. I would like to say there is hope, though. We have learned a great deal about how schools can be reformed in order to make them more accepting places and to help young gay people achieve in school and move on to happy, healthy adult lives. First, it's important to understand the theory of change we've developed. Change must proceed along what we call the 3 Ps: policies, programs, and practices. Policies are the official guidelines for the school, such as anti-bullying policies, anti-harassment policies, anti-discrimination policies. Programming is the curricular and other offerings of the school. For instance, what kinds of books are in the library, what kinds of trainings do the teachers receive. Practices is talking about the individual practices and how people are actually treating one another as individuals, not as institutions, but as individuals. Any effective effort at school reform must address all three Ps. What people tend to do is they pick one P and they focus only on that. Like they will pass a policy, put it in the guidelines, and then assume they're done without ever training teachers on how to enforce the policy. Or they will start a discussion program with students, but they won't do any training for the teachers, or they won't put in place a policy so that when the discussion program ends, the change ends. Each of these things are worthy to do by themselves, but if you want them to create permanent systemic change in your school system, you must do all three. And we've also found that schools evolve along a continuum. Most schools start as hostile schools. These are schools where there is no policy, no programming, and no one wants to talk about the issue. They then tend to become resistant schools, which is a school where there are a few people who are willing to talk about the issue, but most people will not. Then they become a passive school. That's when they put everything in the handbook and they put up the posters and they do everything they're supposed to do, but they don't really deal with the issue in any depth. Then hopefully they become an inclusive school, and that's when they're constantly monitoring to make sure that everyone in the school feels included, everyone in the school feels like they belong. Let me try an informal poll with you. How many of you would say the school you attended was hostile? How many of you would say the school you attended was resistant? How many of you would say the school you attended was passive? How many would say it was inclusive? We have 2 hands for inclusive. So clearly we have a long way to go. Now, let's talk first about institutional policies and what we know works. First of all, we know that the clearer and more inclusive your policy is, the more it empowers faculty to take action. What I mean by that is you must enumerate in your policy categories: race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, gender identity, because when you give specific direction to staff, they feel more empowered to intervene. We actually did a study in the United States looking at schools that had no policies, schools that have what we call generic policies. These are ones that simply say bullying is bad, but they don't specify any particular categories. And then schools that had comprehensive policies that actually specify categories. Guess what we found? We found that rates of intervention by teachers when bias incidents occurred rose dramatically when the comprehensive policy was in place. Students also report back to us that when there's a comprehensive policy in place, what the teachers do is more effective when dealing with harassment. So, the role of the policy is to empower the staff of the school to intervene effectively. Staff often will not intervene unless they feel they are backed by policy. And sometimes people say, oh, those policies don't make a difference, they're just words on paper. Actually, they make a huge difference. They lead to greatly differential rates of intervention and effectiveness of those interventions. Now let's talk about programs and practices. In terms of programming, I want to explain the concept to you of distinguishing behavior. What this literally means is behavior that distinguishes you from what people expect of you. Let me give an example. As a white teacher, there is no reason for a student of color to assume that I automatically understand the issues they face. So if I want to be seen as a sympathetic teacher, I'm going to have to do something to show that I'm sympathetic. Those actions can take 2 forms. One is reactive, one is proactive. Reactive is when something bad happens, you do something about it. If you hear racist language, you respond. Proactive is when you do not wait for bad things to happen, but instead you address the issue ahead of a problem. Like, for instance, perhaps you include information in the United States context about the African American civil rights movement in your history curriculum, which is what I used to teach. What those behaviors do is they signal to a student that you are someone who is sympathetic and willing to talk. And students will, instead of lumping you with all the other adults, because let's keep in mind a lot of students lump all adults together and think adults just don't get it, they may begin to think maybe this teacher gets it. Now, the same thing needs to happen around the issue of sexual orientation. I have bad news for those of you who are heterosexual educators. LGBT students do not trust you. They have no reason to trust you. Their whole life has taught them, do not trust heterosexual people. They've probably seen very, very few heterosexual people who actually care. So if you want to be seen as somebody who they can turn to, you're going to have to distinguish yourself through your behavior. How can you do that? First of all, this is not Kevin's theory. This is based on statistics. LGBT students don't usually bother to tell people they've been harassed or assaulted. 62% of them say they've never told an adult they've been harassed or assaulted at their school. Only 5% usually tell the adults. Why is that? Because even when they do tell adults, adults don't do much about it. 41% of students reported to us that when staff were present and anti-LGBT comments were made, they had never, let me repeat, never in their school career seen a teacher intervene. Now, when you consider how pervasive this language is, how frequently they hear it every day, the fact that 41% say they've never seen anyone intervene is stunning. Only 15% reported that the adults always or most of the time intervene. So the reality is these young people are looking at adults and they're saying these people don't get it. There's no reason to tell them about my problems or that I've been harassed or assaulted because they don't care, and they're not going to do anything because they don't do anything. They stand by and they do nothing when it occurs. Now, here's the good news about that. When staff do engage in distinguishing behaviors, such as intervening when homophobic comments are made, students' sense of safety increases dramatically. What this chart shows us is that in the schools where students say the teachers never or only some of the time intervene when homophobic comments are made, 72% of them feel unsafe. That rate drops to 36%. It drops in half when teachers are intervening. So your actions can convince students that the school is a safe place. How do you react effectively when you hear anti-gay language? Well, that is going to be a function of the time and place in which you hear the language. In short, more time, more structure, the better your intervention can be. Less time, less structure, the more punitive your intervention has to be. What do those look like? Let's start in the upper left-hand corner. That assumes that you have a lot of time and a lot of structure, like maybe somebody uses the word pede at the beginning of a classroom session. If you were to ask me, based on 24 years of experience, what is the best thing you could say at that point? I would say to you what to say would be, what do you mean by that? Because often students are using language without even thinking about the meaning of the word. Now let's go to the other extreme, the bottom left-hand corner. This is you're walking down a hallway and you're late for class and the students are rushing and you hear someone use that word. You don't have time for a discussion at that point. You can't ask them, well, what do you mean by that? And have a long extended dialogue because you have to get to class. What you can do is simply say that it's unacceptable. Say things like, stop, I'm sending you to the office, that language is unacceptable, cut it out, whatever you need to say. The critical thing is whenever you hear the language, you must respond. And let me give you two more pieces of advice around how to intervene effectively. If you're in the bottom left-hand corner and you've had to do a very punitive response, circle back to the students, schedule a meeting with them later, and have the dialogue beginning with what did you mean by that, and understand why they're engaging in the behavior. Otherwise, if the only thing that happens is that you punish them, they will simply quit saying the word when you are around. They won't actually quit using the language because they've not thought about why the language is a problem. They will just stop when you're around. The second thing I would tell you about effective intervention is not to single out the student, him or herself. It is better to say when you hear the language, that language is unacceptable at our school, rather than say, Kevin, don't say that. Because when you make it all about Kevin, then you aren't reinforcing that it's everyone's responsibility to not use the language. So hopefully these, and by the way, the most important thing you can do, when I was a teacher in Massachusetts, the governor of our state asked me to chair a commission on gay and lesbian youth. and we did hearings around the state. We took testimony from over 100 gay and lesbian youth. At the end of every testimony, I asked every youth the same question. I said, what upsets you the most about what you experience at school? What was interesting was the universal response. It was not, I get bullied and harassed. LGBT students are not stupid. Many of them understand that there are hateful people in the world and they're going to be treated in a hateful way at times. They know the real world. The universal response was this: I always thought the teachers would do something about it. I was so shocked when they didn't. That was what upset them the most. They weren't shocked that there were bullies and bigots in the world. They were shocked that adults did nothing about it. Now, you may feel uncomfortable intervening in a situation like this. You may be afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. Well, I have two pieces of advice for you. Number one, the only wrong thing you can say is nothing. Because as Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, once put it, silence helps the tormentor, never the tormented. So don't worry about saying the wrong thing unless you say nothing, in which case you have indeed said the wrong thing. The second thing is I'm now going to tell you a very embarrassing story to illustrate to you that you can say really stupid things and recover. And it'll be about my own teaching career. I was once teaching U.S. history, and I had 17 students in my classroom, 16 white students and 1 black student. I was discussing that day the topic of slavery. And I was very, very nervous about how the discussion would go. I didn't want my 1 black student to feel like he would have to speak for all black people or to feel singled out or something. So I felt very nervous. And I don't know, I've never been in a Swiss classroom, so I don't know how they run, but I was this kind of funky liberal teacher. I didn't make the kids raise their hands. When they wanted to talk, they just talked. So if Elizabeth and Stefan started talking at the same time, I would simply say one of their names. I'd say Stefan, and that would be Stefan's signal that he had the floor to talk. Now, on this day when I'm teaching slavery, I have 2 students who begin to speak at the same time. One is Matthew, my black student, and the other is Belinda, a white student, who answers every question I ever ask in my class. Matthew very rarely answers a question, and I'm so excited that he feels comfortable speaking in my class this day, and I know I've heard from Belinda a million times already, so I thought, why don't I call on Matthew? So I turned to Matthew, I looked right at him, and I said, black? I did what any mature professional educator would do at that point. I looked at my class and I said, I have to go now. And I left the room. I walked out of the classroom. I hyperventilated in the hallway for about 10 minutes. And then I realized, I thought about sending in pizza and leaving them in there for the rest of the day. But I realized that wasn't going to work and that I would have to at some point go back into the classroom. So I walked back into the classroom and I said, we need to talk about what I just said. And we had a fascinating discussion in which actually Belinda said at one point, I don't understand. You know, we're supposed to be colorblind. We're not supposed to notice that people are black. And Matt replied, you think I don't know that I'm black? So fast forward several years later. I'm now in a graduate program at Columbia University, which is a very prestigious university in the United States. I'm in the gymnasium one day working out. I hear a voice behind me, Mr. Jennings. I turn around, and it's Matt. Matt was an undergraduate at Columbia while I was in graduate school. I had not seen him in several years. I said, Matt, it's very good to see you. And he said, yeah, I saw you over here, and I wanted to come over and tell you something. You know, I'm majoring in history because of your class, and I've just been given a Rhodes Scholarship, and I'm going to Oxford next year to continue my studies. And I just want to say thanks for inspiring me to study history. Now, here's the moral of our story. If you're afraid you will say the wrong thing when you intervene in racist or homophobic or sexist language, think of this. You can never say anything as stupid as I said. It is impossible to be that stupid, other than Kevin Jennings, all right? But if students see that you're trying they see that you actually care about them, they see that your heart is in the right place, they will forgive you doing the wrong thing because they know you're trying. What students never forgive is when we do not try, and neither should they. The second thing in terms of distinguishing behavior is to be proactive. Do not wait for somebody to say pede in your classroom, although I'm pretty sure you'll get it by the end of the week. Why not incorporate issues about LGBT people into your curriculum now? Very easy if you teach history, literature, or science, and we're going to talk about how it can also be done in other areas. Unfortunately, in the United States, it's still very rare that this happens. 86% of students tell us that they're never taught anything about LGBT people in their classes. This is unfortunate because in the schools where we have inclusive curriculum, students are much less likely to say that they feel unsafe. So including it in your curriculum increases students' sense of safety. Now, I'm going to pick on math teachers for a second because I've done many of these workshops, as I've mentioned, and it's always the math teacher who says, I can't incorporate this into my curriculum. It has nothing to do with math. All right? Now, I don't know if you do these in Swiss curriculum. I asked last night, and some people said you did. But there are these things that are called word problems. Like Elizabeth and Kevin are buying a new house with 5% interest, compounded for 20 years on a $100,000 mortgage. How much will Elizabeth and Kevin's house cost? Well, I discovered when we signed our mortgage a few years ago that Kevin and Jeff have to pay mortgage interest too. So there's no reason you can't change that word problem to say Kevin and Jeff are buying a house at 5% annual interest and $100,000. How much will their mortgage cost? That's an example of how our curriculum is heterosexist, even in places that are supposedly neutral, like the math classroom. And I want to be really clear about what we're talking about here. Some people say, we don't want to teach approval of homosexuality, blah, 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 blah. What you're teaching is the real world. Some of these students are going to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered. All of them are going to know LGBT people. They're going to go to university with LGBT people. They're going to work with LGBT people. They're probably going to have LGBT people in their family. Part of the job of a school is to prepare students for the real world, and the real world includes LGBT people. We shouldn't be surprised when adults react badly to LGBT people when they were taught nothing about them in school. What did we think was going to happen? But if we start teaching the reality that there are LGBT people, not only will we help LGBT students feel more safe in school, we'll help non-LGBT students be prepared for the real world they're going to live in. Now, the last thing I wanted some of the slides to emphasize is there are days when you're a teacher. How many people are actually working in a school? Okay. In the United States, we have this radio station in New Mexico, and it sends signals into outer space in hopes that other life forms will someday respond. This is like teaching. Often you are sending signals into a classroom, hoping there are life forms there that might actually respond. And you might actually wonder whether you're having any impact. But the fact is, when staff are supportive of students, students are much less likely to feel unsafe because of their sexual orientation or their gender expression, and they are significantly less likely to miss school for that. And it's important to recognize that the magic number for supportive staff in a school seems to be 6. We don't know why. But there is something about having a critical mass of adults that seems to make a big difference for young people. So keep this in mind. If you can recruit just a few of your colleagues to start speaking up and start intervening when bad things happen, you will dramatically increase students' sense of safety and decrease absenteeism. Now, there may be times also when you think this is hopeless because you think there's so much bigotry, I can never change that. This is not true. Studies of bigotry show that it falls along what we call a bell curve. At one end of the bell curve, there are people who are extremely bigoted. At the other end of the bell curve, there are people who are very fair-minded. Most people are in the middle on the bell. They have a variety of feelings that are not deep-seated bigotry. We actually surveyed students, teenagers in America, and we asked them questions designed to figure out where on the bell curve they were. Guess what we found? Only 13% of students agreed strongly with the statement, I don't like gay people. 37% actually agreed strongly with the statement, I respect and admire gay people. But the biggest number, right in the middle of our bell curve, were the 50% who said, it doesn't bother me as long as they leave me alone, which is kind of the American attitude towards everything, actually. But now, as a teacher, this is good news. This means that only about 1 in 7 of your students actually dislikes gay people. The majority of them don't really care. And a significant minority actually like gay people. So you may be hearing this language a lot. If you're hearing the language a lot, the reason you're hearing it is because we're tolerating it. And we're letting the bigots set the tone for our schools. We actually asked young gay people themselves the same question, how accepting do you think your peers are of you as a gay person? Once again, we have a significant bell curve. Only about 9% said their peers were very accepting. Only about 8% said they were not at all accepting. About 80% were somewhere in the middle. So, we are not dealing here with a deep-seated, ingrained prejudice that we can do nothing about. Only a small minority of people actually have a deep-seated, ingrained prejudice towards gay people. Most people are somewhere in the middle. And your challenge as an educator is how do you help them avoid the dark side of bigotry, to quote Star Wars, and come to the bright side where they accept people who are not like themselves. 2 thoughts on that. Number 1, in the United States, we know this works because I lived through the very end of segregation, racial segregation in our schools in America. It was in 2nd grade that white and black students were compelled to go to school together when I was a kid, and racist language was pervasive in schools, and violence between black and white students was pervasive. My nieces and nephews, the next generation of my family, look at me, I get what I call the crazy Uncle Kevin look when I start telling them stories about this, because they would never dare use that kind of language, because they have been educated. We have laws, we have policies, we have programs, and practices have changed as a result. I'm not saying racism is gone, it is not. But the kind of casual bigotry that pervaded schools in America when I was a child on race has been significantly reduced. So we know, first of all, that schools can make a huge difference. We've seen it happen on other issues. We can make it happen on this issue. Secondly, we need to recognize that people's attitudes towards difference fall along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, there are people who encounter people who are not like themselves, and they are repulsed by them. They believe they're crazy and sick and wrong, and they don't want to be around them. At the other end of the spectrum are people who believe in nurturance. They assume that differences among people are indispensable to society and that we should nurture and encourage them. I would suspect most of you are probably more towards the nurturance end than the repulsion end, because you wouldn't be here tonight if you were on the repulsion end, all right? Now, I have bad news for you. The people who feel repulsion have a human right to feel that. In America, we call it the First Amendment. We give everybody freedom of speech, freedom of thought. The fact is, bigots are entitled to think that I'm a pervert who is going to hell. I may not like that they think that, but they have a right to think what they want to think. I don't have the right to tell them what they have to think. This changes, however, once we enter the school context. Because for schools, we must all be at the level of support. We must work to safeguard the rights of people who are different, period. And I'm speaking specifically to the educators in the audience right now. So let me try my poll again. How many of you are educators? Raise your hand, please. Okay, thank you. My next question, and I want it to be the truth. How many of you like every child you teach? Okay, thanks. You may be slow, but at least you're not liars in Switzerland. So every now and then somebody will raise their hand. I'll be like, oh, really? The fact is, it is not incumbent upon us to like or approve of all of our students, but it is incumbent upon us to support every one of our students. That is our job. And I want to be really clear to educators in Switzerland my stance on this. You personally can believe that gay people are perverts. You personally can believe that gay people are wrong. But if you bring that attitude into a classroom and you let students get hurt by it, you deserve to be fired. Because every teacher should be able to support every one of their students, whether they like them or not. What we're talking about here is the distinctions between beliefs and behaviors. People are entitled to believe whatever they want. That's the beauty of a democratic, free society. But also, one of the responsibilities in a free democratic society is to engage in respectful behavior towards your fellow citizens, whether you agree with or like them or not. And I'm very aware that Switzerland is a very diverse country. The only way Switzerland continues to work as a country is if the values of respect are taught in your schools. Because otherwise, the diversity of Switzerland, if we get to a point where students start believing it's okay to discriminate against other people because they have a different skin color, a different sexual orientation, or they speak a different language, Switzerland doesn't work as a nation. So in America, we used to always talk about how schools taught the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. We now talk about how you have to teach 4 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and respect. That those are all fundamental lessons that young people must learn in school because democracy cannot survive, it cannot flourish without it. But I also want to bring this back to a personal level. And I want to talk to you not only about the great theory of why we have to do this because it's right and it's the democratic thing to do, but because of young people's lives. This is a young man named Carl Joseph Walker Hoover. He was a 6th grader in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is about an hour west of where I taught in Concord, Massachusetts. He was relentlessly harassed in his school in the 2008-2009 school year. Carl was not, as far as we know, gay, but he was perceived to be gay, so other students called him gay, they called him faggot, they called him a variety of hateful words. In April of 2009, Carl came home from school, and he went directly to his room. His mother was preparing dinner at the time. Mrs. Walker thought that her son was doing homework. She didn't think anything of it. She finished preparing dinner. She called for her son to come down to dinner. He didn't respond. She then went and knocked on his door. He did not respond. She assumed maybe he had on headphones or something, was listening to music, so she just opened the door to his room. And when she did, she found her 11-year-old son hanging from the roof of his bedroom. Carl had decided he'd rather die than go back to school. How have we come to a point where some young people would rather die than go to school? But that is the dilemma that many young LGBT people face. Do I go back to a place where every day I am made to feel unwelcome, I'm made to feel unworthy, I'm made to feel that I have no value? Or do I escape in some way? Some students escape by dropping out. Some students escape by withdrawing. Some students escape by drugs or alcohol. Some students choose to escape from life altogether. We as educators have got to do better. So tomorrow when we go back into our classrooms, I want you to think about Carl. None of us wants to be Carl's teacher. And I want you to remember the things I said tonight, that the things we do as teachers can and do make a real difference in those young people's lives. It is a great privilege to be a teacher. Use that privilege and that power wisely. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Okay. Sure. Or I can just call on people. I'll just call on people. Thank you. Thank you. You continue to enlarge my head. I'd like to open it up, and I understand some people have other commitments. If you have to leave, I won't feel insulted. But for those of you who could stay, perhaps you have a few questions or comments you would like to make, and I will try my best to answer them. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question if you would like to ask one. And don't be shy. This is our class participation grade. Yes. Absolutely. This is a great question. I apologize for not addressing the issue. Let me say two things in response. Let me repeat the question so people can hear it. What about the experiences of children who have LGBT parents? First of all, we have clubs in American schools called Gay Straight Alliances. And let me tell you how they began. When I was teaching 24 years ago, a young girl came to me one day and said, I'd like to start a club to fight homophobia at our school. And I was surprised because I knew she had a boyfriend, so I thought she was straight. So I kind of asked her, assuming she would now tell me she was a lesbian. I was like, so tell me, why do you care so much about this? Expecting her now to tell me she was a lesbian. And she said, well, that's easy. My mother's a lesbian, and I'm tired of hearing my family get put down around this school. I was very surprised. This is 24 years ago, before LGBT parents were so common. And so I didn't know what else to say. I said, so what do you want to call your club? She said, I don't know, you're gay and I'm straight. Let's call it the Gay Straight Alliance. There are now over 5,000 Gay Straight Alliance clubs in American schools. All started by a young girl who had lesbian parents. Secondly, at GLSEN, which our website, by the way, is glsen.org, we did an extensive study on lesbian and gay-headed families. And what we found was this. First of all, I'll tell you the great finding of it, which was that LGBT parents actually made more involved and better parents than heterosexual parents. That was because most of them had worked very hard to have children. They didn't have children by accident, so they thought a lot about being a good parent, and they were much more likely to be volunteers at their children's school, much more likely to be helping their children with homework at home. They simply were doing the things that good parents do at a higher rate than heterosexual parents. But they also found that the schools tended to resist their involvement and treat them like they were invisible. So, and we know that that has a negative impact on their children because part of belonging at school is feeling like you and your family are accepted. So when LGBT-headed families do not feel accepted at school, their children don't feel accepted. And we see the same pattern of performances that we see among LGBT youth themselves who are not accepted. So I think that this is an absolutely critical issue to address, and it should be addressed beginning early in school. You know, when I grew up in America, we used to read these books called the Dick and Jane books. Dick and Jane were these little white children who had little white parents in a little white town. And that was the only image of family we got. Now our students read with very, very different images of families. Families of different racial backgrounds, different religious heritages, and yes, families that are headed by 2 men or 2 women. I would urge you to do the same thing in Switzerland because the reality is for that student who's sitting there in the classroom feeling like they don't belong, that one book that you read out of 50 will be all they need to feel like, yes, I belong in this school.
Thank you.
Another question? Oh, over here, sorry. C'est d'accord.
Alors, je m'excuse, je parlerai en français.
Ouais.
C'est juste pour revenir un petit peu sur le débat que vous avez fait.
Lentement, lentement.
Excusez-moi, c'est un défaut que j'ai. Personnellement, j'ai fait mon coming out à 22 ans. Tous mes amis, tout mon entourage étaient au courant bien avant que je fasse mon coming out. Ce fut un soulagement pour tout le monde quand je l'ai dit, et je le vis très bien. Et je profite d'avoir la parole pour saluer Stéphane Rittoser, ici présent. S'il me reconnaît. Tu me reconnais?
Pop quiz.
Je parle après.
Thank you for sharing your story. And most of all, thank you for your courage. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for your courage. Yes.
Bonjour, je vais aussi devoir vous parler en français, même si je parle un peu anglais. Vous avez dit à un moment qu'il faut éduquer les jeunes générations. Vous avez pris comme exemple qu'avant, après la fin de la ségrégation raciale, en grandissant, les jeunes générations ont changé de mentalité par rapport aux précédentes, et qu'on ne peut plus être aussi raciste qu'avant, en tout cas plus aussi ouvertement. Et là,
I'm having trouble understanding him. I'm sorry.
You have a say.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm just having a little trouble understanding. My French is rusty, remember. So I'll let Stefan translate for me a bit. Okay? Okay, so you're saying about racism?
Yeah, and that society has evolved and it's not as racist as it used to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Et je remarque là que, en tout cas ces dernières années, l'homosexualité se fait de moins en moins tabou. On en parle de plus en plus, et aussi dans ce qu'on peut appeler la culture, on le voit de plus en plus dans des films, dans certaines bandes dessinées qui sont consacrées. Il commence même à y avoir parfois des chaînes de télé spécialement. Donc pensez-vous qu'avec justement le fait que ce soit plus montré dans la culture, là, ce soit plus, les jeunes de cette époque-là grandiront, seront moins tabous, le verront, serait justement mieux que les précédents, puisque là, ils le verraient plus. C'est que c'est moins un sujet tabou.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm sorry my French is so bad. A couple of quick responses to that question. First of all, there's a famous saying by the artist Andy Warhol. People will tell you that time changes things, but actually you have to change them yourself. So I want to be really clear. I don't think that we will see more acceptance of LGBT people simply because time passes. It will take deliberate actions. And those actions obviously include more representation in the media. You're absolutely right. But it also means more actions by political leaders, more actions by education leaders, more actions by religious leaders. We have this kind of false sense of history sometimes, at least in the United States, that things just get better and better and better on their own. Well, the reason why America is a less racist country, I don't know Swiss history enough to answer why Swiss is less racist than it used to be, is because there were people who sacrificed their lives for that, who literally were killed protesting to make our society more equal. It didn't happen just because time passed. So I think the media representation is important, but I think a couple of things about it. Number one, it is not enough in and of itself. We must see other sectors in society taking action if we want to see change occur. And number two, it won't happen all by itself. Like in America, Ellen DeGeneres was a huge pioneer because she chose to come out in the mid-90s when there were no openly gay people on television. I just don't know. Is there a Swiss Ellen DeGeneres? Yes? Excellent. So there needs to be somebody who takes the lead. Like I'll say something inappropriate maybe. I'm very disappointed that Swiss television chose not to cover this. They were asked and they did not show up. That seems very strange to me. So maybe the media still has some work to do here in Switzerland. Yes, sir.
In a world where things have to be refracted through a lens of respectability and politeness, that's what I often find really difficult to confront. I wondered whether you got any advice on how to deal with comments like, you know, due to time constraints, we can't deal with this issue, or it's or it's impolite, or being quarantined is a bit absurd or a bit radical. When you're kind of working with powerful people, it can be quite difficult to find the strength sometimes, I think.
Well, fantastic question. because I think that, and you're sharing your story was very courageous. I think that it's important to recognize that being an activist is exhausting. Because you are constantly trying to get, it's like, think of it this way, it's like a law of physics. You're trying to get an inert gas to move, all right? And that sometimes can be very, very difficult. So first of all, if you are an activist, which I applaud, and there is a time to be radical, and I applaud that as well, I would urge you to take care of yourself because we need you for the long term. Change does not come overnight. The changes I'm discussing with you in America, we began this work 24 years ago. I had no gray hair, and I was 30 pounds lighter. So, it was a long time ago. So take care of yourself, first of all. Secondly, dealing with the frustration, I would give you two pieces of advice. Number one, meet people where they are. And what I mean by that is every school in Switzerland wants young people to do well in school. So do we. So let's start by agreeing on what we already agree on. If we're approaching a school, say, I know that you want your students to do well. So do I. So I'm going to tell you about this problem that's stopping some students from doing well so that you could do your job better. I think sometimes we try to drag them to where we are. There's an old joke in America, how many gay activists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. So we are sometimes very humorless in our approach. And I think sometimes meeting them where their values are is very important. And someone says they don't have enough time, I would say, I know you really care about children, and you're telling me you don't have time to talk about the children? I find that hard to believe. The second thing I would say, and this is a little bit of, I think, a cultural difference between the United States and Switzerland. I think that in the United States, you all know us, we'll talk about anything. That's the way Americans are. We'll just tell you our personal life 30 seconds after meeting you. I think in Switzerland that's considered very impolite. So you're battling a cultural difference where just the very discussion of these issues is considered impolite. Well, my answer to that is, what's going to make you more uncomfortable? Talking about gay and lesbian issues or going to your child's funeral? Which one would make you more uncomfortable? Because that is what we're talking about here. So people need to get over being uncomfortable because too much is at stake. The final piece of advice I would have is there's a famous lesbian writer in America named Audre Lorde, and she once said, the timetable of the oppressor and the timetable of the oppressed have nothing in common. You and I want this change tomorrow. We may feel things are moving very slowly. For people who are uncomfortable, this may feel like lightning speed. And you need to remember that they are where they are. We have to meet them where they are and bring them along and not get frustrated. Because if we get frustrated, we lose. Another question. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you so much for coming here to Switzerland to see us.
It's an honor.
Well, I'm not Swiss myself, so.
It's still an honor.
I just had a question about what you see as the role of an educator when a parent, tells their student or tells their son or daughter that they don't agree with them being gay. I mean, if the student comes to you saying, my parents don't agree with my sexual orientation, I mean, I feel like maybe it's stepping a bit over the boundaries for a teacher to say, well, I support you. I don't know. I mean, I think that in a place like the U.S., that's where the collide kind of comes, when parents feel like teachers are overstepping the boundaries.
Well, it's a really great question. And the one thing I would say in response to that is, actually, I'd say two things. First of all, we have to recognize that coming out is a process. We all know that if we're gay. So is coming to terms with the fact that you have an LGBT child. It's a process. And one thing I would urge any teacher to do is to try and get resources to the parents. Because remember, parents do not expect to have an LGBT child. They're raised to expect that all of their children will be heterosexual. So they're probably not bad people. they're just confused and maybe in some cases afraid. Like my mother, she reacted very badly when I came out. And many years later, I found out that the main reason she reacted that way was not because she was prejudiced towards gay people, but because she was afraid I would have a more difficult life because I was gay, and she wanted to protect me from that. And she was hoping I would not be gay because she knew my life would be easier if I was not. That's not a bad parent. That's actually a very good parent, just a little misguided. So I noticed that you have a group for parents here in Switzerland out here tonight, so I would urge you to take advantage of those resources. Where's Elizabeth? Elizabeth has written a wonderful book which talks about the process of parents coming to terms with their children being LGBT. I would say get the parents some resources because they're probably feeling very isolated themselves, very confused, and don't know where to go. Secondly, with the student, the most important thing to recognize about students, period, is that isolated students are at-risk students. And the most important thing you need to do with a student who's in that situation is to keep them talking to you. Because if they have no other adults to talk to, that's when they become at risk for suicide. So the most important thing to do is just keep that student talking to you and saying, look, your parents are going through a process. This is very difficult for them. You're a wonderful kid. Understand that they have to go through their own process in their own time so that that young person continues talking to you. I don't think it's your job to tell the parent, you better accept your child. I think it's your job to get the parent some resources so that they can better understand the child that they have. Another question? In the back, ma'am? Can we give her the microphone, please? I just can't hear.
My question is, when you are a teacher and yourself are a gay person, I myself, when I was a child, I suffered a lot for a lack of model. So nobody was there. I didn't know that gay adults exist. So I do suffer of not being out with my the children of my class. Mm-hmm. I sometimes I kind of drop some sentences, but I'm not really openly out. And I don't know if I should or not, if it's risky or if it can cause more damages than good consequences. But deeply inside, I believe it would be the right thing to do. But the stage of the situation right now, I don't feel like really comfortable with that. So what is your advice?
I know how you feel, first of all. Because when I began teaching in 1985, I was not out, and I had never seen or met an out gay teacher. So one thing I did, I have a book, if you read English well enough, I invite any of you to read it. If you're French speaking, translate it into French for me, called One Teacher in 10. It's a collection of writings by LGBT teachers. You can get it online at Amazon or any other bookseller. And the reason I did that book was I think the way each teacher deals with the issue is different, and that book contains 40 stories by teachers who deal with the issue in all kinds of different ways. So you will find the way that works for you, is my first piece of advice. You will know when the time and place comes that you need to say that you are gay or lesbian. For me, that moment came when I had a gay student come to me, and he was thinking of committing suicide, and I was obviously upset, and I did everything a teacher would do. I told him his life was worth living, and he should go see the counselor, and etc. And he said to me, why shouldn't I do this? My life isn't worth saving anyway. And I thought, that was what propelled me to come out to all of my students. Because I thought, I can't sit by and let these students suffer the way I suffered. I just couldn't do it anymore. So I think you'll find that moment when it comes to you. And one thing that, and you know this, one thing that young LGBT people tell us is that having an out LGBT teacher makes a huge difference in their lives. Now I will say two more last things on this subject. First of all, I feel very strongly that we all live in a glass closet. And what I mean by that is, the kids all know we're gay already. They're not stupid. They pick up on the clues. They know. By the time we tell them, most of them have figured it out. The second thing I would say is that teachers come out all the time in Switzerland. It's very exciting for me. Unfortunately, they're all heterosexual. Heterosexual teachers, going back to your comment earlier, there are going to be some people who say, well, that's not appropriate. You shouldn't talk about this with your students. Well, heterosexual teachers do it all the time, don't they? So either all the heterosexual teachers in Switzerland have to go back in the closet, or the LGBT teachers get to come out too. No double standards. That's my argument. Let's see. Yes, sir. Actually, I called on you once. Can I call someone else? Okay, go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah, to repeat the question basically is it more difficult in rural and small town areas than in big cities? And I'm actually going to take back my original answer of yes. And let me explain why. I think the problem is different. As you've just described it, what we know from reports of rural LGBT youth is that the main problem they suffer is isolation. You know, the lack of information, the lack of role models, the lack of community. In urban areas, the main problem the LGBT youth face is overt harassment. Sometimes being more visible also makes you a bigger target. So I would say the challenges are different for small town and rural areas than in urban areas. In urban areas, you're more likely to have access to information and you're more likely to have a sense of community, but you're also more likely to be the victim of violence. Whereas in small town areas, you're more likely to be the victim of isolation. And that actually correlates very strongly with suicide. If you follow all these suicides in America, most of them have happened in small towns. So in suburbs, not in big cities. Yes, sir.
Thank you. We talk about what influenced the LGBT youth in schools. We talk about role models, activists. I myself am a law student, and I would like to know whether the legal frame which is being talked now in our parliament, we're talking about gay adoption, or more or less. I would like to know, how do you think the legal frame is important for LGBT youth, and how much about the news about the legal changes are important to be talked in schools or not?
Three quick things. First of all, as I talked about with the policies, programs, practices, theory of change, I think legal policies are absolutely critical. You cannot have real change without legal policies. Secondly, one of the things that we've learned in America is that when gay legal issues become a controversy, like in the states where we have had referendums to repeal gay marriage, the levels of violence towards gay people have gone up dramatically. So when politicians engage in gay bashing, and I'm sure you've got some in Switzerland that do, every country does, it empowers gay bashing on the streets. And I think they need to be held accountable for that. The third thing I would say is that about role models, because you made me realize that I have not talked about the most important role model that we need, which is we need heterosexual role models. And what I mean by that is we need heterosexual people who are allies, who will come out in support of LGBT people. Because the majority of our heterosexual students, our students are heterosexual, and they need to see what non-bigoted heterosexual people look and act like. So when we talk about role models, we tend to focus on wanting a gay role model for a gay kid, but we also need white role models of non-racist white people. We need male role models of non-sexist men. And we need heterosexual role models of non-homophobic heterosexual people. So everyone in here is a role model, regardless of whether you're heterosexual or LGBT, whether you're white or a person of color. The question is, who are you modeling to and what are you modeling? And since the majority of our students are heterosexual, I would say the amount of role models we need really needs to come from the heterosexual community. And sadly, I don't think that we've seen, in a lot of cases, a lot of really visible straight allies, as we call them in America, who can be role models for other young straight people. So let's keep in mind that role models they're not just LGBT, they can be heterosexual too. We are getting close to the time I think we're supposed to finish, so I'm going to take what we call in America a lightning round, which is you're going to tell me your question very quickly, and I'm going to answer it in less than 60 seconds. Okay? Yes, microphone, please. Or if you have a very loud voice. Ah oui? Un moment, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Je voulais dire qu'il semble important, quand on aborde la diversité sexuelle, d'aborder les diversités sexuelles avec les élèves, avec les jeunes en général, parce que je fais partie des personnes qui donnent les cours d'éducation sexuelle. Et ces cours sont beaucoup mieux perçus sur ce point de vue de la prévention de l'homophobie lorsque on présente les diverses minorités sexuelles et pas seulement les minorités à l'orientation sexuelle. Alors c'est important de parler aussi des genres, des transgenres, comme vous l'avez fait, et puis aussi, dans les cours d'éducation sexuelle, des gens qui sont intersexués ou hermaphrodites. Et puis de manière générale, dans les écoles, je pense qu'il est important de contextualiser la lutte contre l'homophobie avec d'autres luttes pour les droits des minorités en général et en tout cas des diverses minorités sexuelles en tout cas.
I could not agree more. One program we started in the United States, I urge you to look up on the web, is called No Name Calling Week, and it is a program for grades kindergarten through 8. It addresses all forms of name calling, not just anti-gay name calling, but racist name calling, disability name calling, another very important issue that gets overlooked. I think the more we can put this struggle within the context of creating a school that is respectful for all people, the better it will go. I agree. Next question.
Attendez, excusez-moi.
No, this might.
Okay. So I'm Jacqueline Roitz. I'm a member of the Parliament of Geneva. I want to say that I'm very honored by your visit.
Thank you.
Your head will become more bigger. I would like to, I am in a commission, Human Rights Commission, and we are now working on LGBT questions. And I would like to know what is better, because we have seen the film, the movie, It's Elementary, and so we don't know exactly what is important now. Is more to sensibilize and to talk with children, or is it more to sensibilize the teachers?
The teachers.
So,
well, it is not what we call in English an either-or proposition. You should do both and. But I would say if you had to make a choice, I would focus first on the teachers. The reason for that is the teachers are going to be there for a long time. They set the tone at the school. And by getting the teachers to be in the right place around the issue, you will affect the attitudes of the students. So I think staff training is absolutely critical. And I would urge you, if you only have a certain amount of resources, to focus first on that, because getting the staff in alignment is critical in terms of getting the students in alignment. Yes, back here.
Hi, thanks. Just going back to something that you brought up earlier at the beginning of your presentation, you were speaking of sex and saying that we needed to align orientation, behavior, and identity. And then when speaking of gender, you said that we needed to coincide sex expression and identity also. I identify as being queer. I highly believe in fluidity, and I was wondering, why is it so important for those to align?
What I mean by that is I would want people who feel like they're queer to feel like they can come out as queer. And I'm not saying that you'd necessarily have to do gender reassignment surgery. That's not what I meant to suggest. What I meant is when we create a situation where someone feels compelled to engage in gender expression that is not authentic to them, we damage them. So if queer gender expression is what is authentic to you, I would want to create an environment where you were able to express yourself in that way, to not feel that you had to adopt a different identity or a different mode of gender expression simply because society expects you as a biological man or a biological woman to act in a certain way. You should feel able to act in a way that is consistent with how you feel inside, not what society thinks you should act like based on their assessment of your gender. Does that make sense?
So they don't need to be aligned, they just need to be aligned with how you feel.
Right. They need to be aligned. Your identity needs to be aligned with how you feel inside. That the problem is when people are not able to be authentic to themselves. And the reason that usually happens, and let's be honest, gender nonconforming people bear the brunt of hatred towards LGBT people. They are the ones who are most likely to be victimized because we have such strong notions about gender in society. So I think that we need to really realize that you cannot separate the issues of sexism and homophobia because gender nonconforming people prove that sexism and homophobia are completely tied at the wrist. Okay, last one. Yes, sir.
Vous avez parlé d'éduquer les professeurs, d'abord.
Oui.
Et je pense qu'il ne faut pas oublier aussi les professeurs d'éducation physique, parce que c'est souvent lors des cours de gym où finalement il y a beaucoup de discrimination aussi, où on peut mettre de côté le garçon efféminé, le garçon qui n'a pas assez de force, où la performance physique est tellement mise en avant qu'on en arrive des fois à insulter celui qui ne peut pas aller en avant, le traitant de femme laide, de pédé ou autre. Et là, tout d'un coup, les propos homophobes ressortent encore plus lors d'éducation.
Okay.
Là, il ne faut pas oublier d'éduquer ses professeurs aussi.
Basically, the question was, you talked about educating staff members. I think there's a special need to educate physical education teachers or coaches because they are some of the biggest problems. Is that basically what you said? Absolutely true. The fact is, and I would also urge you to educate all staff, not just the classroom teacher. Any adult who's interacting with children needs training, and that includes the sporting coaches. There's a new movement in America, which I'm very proud of, called Athlete Ally, and you can find that on the web at athleteally.org. This is a movement started by young straight athletes to get other young straight athletes to speak up against homophobia in sport. And they actually have a pledge which they get entire teams to take to say they won't use this language and they will speak up if they hear other people using it. I think that, in my opinion, at least in the United States, the two areas in which homophobia is strongest is sports and organized religion. So I think this is very exciting to start to see movements within the sporting world and also movements within the religious world. I want to acknowledge those are happening to address the issues in those sectors because for so long the sporting world has been incredibly homophobic. For example, are there any out stars in the Swiss soccer league? How many people on the soccer side? You know, I mean, the fact of the matter is we have huge problems with homophobia in sporting, and we need to address that. I want to leave you. I want to apologize. I forgot to put up my email address. If any of you ever want a copy of this presentation or have further questions, you can contact me through my website, which is kevinjennings.com. Very easy, myname.com. So you should be able to find it on the web, and you can send me an email through that. Feel free to request the presentation. Feel free to reuse it in your own presentations, to plagiarize, do whatever you want to do with it, because I want you to be able to use it. I just want to close by saying two things. First of all, once again, my tribute to Elizabeth Torango, whose leadership created this evening. And secondly, it is a very, very exciting moment to be in Switzerland. I think that you will look back years from now and be able to say, in 2012 was when, in America, there's a famous book called The Tipping Point, which talks about how things tip, that there's moments in history when we shift from one attitude to the next. I really believe this is the beginning of the tipping point in Swiss schools. That you will look back years from now and go, this is the moment when it started to change. And when schools in Switzerland went from being homophobic to being affirming of LGBT people. And you'll be able to say, I was there that night. Thank you for making history.